Hello, everybody. My name is Sister Estelle, and on behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to this conversation with Father Jeremiah Shryock and John Sweeney on this Franciscan Friday. We are so grateful to be able to gather with all of you during this time of separation. A recording of today's presentation will be available later to share with anyone who couldn't join us, and we'll also let you know how to get a copy of Father Jeremiah's fabulous book, Amid Passing Things, as well as some of our other Franciscan spirituality titles from Paraclete Press. As you know, today, Father Jeremiah and John will be engaging in conversation about what Franciscans do and why. And Father Jeremiah will also be sharing about his new book as well. There will be a time for questions at the end of this hour, so please use your Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post any questions, and we will get to those as time allows. And I'll also be posting various links in the chat bar if you'd like to keep that open as well. Father Jeremiah, he is a Franciscan Friar of the Renewal. He entered the community of Franciscan Friars of the Renewal in 2002. He lives at the House of Prayer in Monticello, New York, where his primary ministries are prayer, spiritual direction, preaching, parish missions, and facilitating retreats. His new book, Amid Passing Things, is a collection of meditations on the ways that God enters our lives, even when we're unaware. Based on his own life experiences, Father Jeremiah offers both struggles and joys that come into a life that's consciously encountering God, the Holy One, all around us, not in some far off place, but right here and now in this life amid passing things. John Sweeney, Paraclete's publisher, is also the author of over 30 books, including the St. Francis Prayer Book, The Complete Francis of Assisi, Lord, Make Me an Instrument of Your Peace, and When St. Francis Saved the Church, winner of a 2015 award in history from the Catholic Press Association, and a charming fiction series for children called The Pope's Cat. He is on the board of the Association of Catholic Publishers and lives in Milwaukee with his wife and daughters, and he joins us from there today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, both Father Jeremiah and John. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And while you were talking, I was looking off into the distance because I am in Milwaukee, but just now there was a coyote walking down the middle of my street. And just as you finished that introduction, he rounded the corner up there and I can't see him now.
Well, that's quite Franciscan, John.
I've never seen that here before.
That's great.
Oh my goodness. It was Brother Wolf right there.
Right.
I was
there
looking
he is. He knew.
While you were talking, Sister Estelle, I could hear my daughter yelling at me from the front yard, and I was deliberately ignoring her because I told her I couldn't talk with her for the next hour. But I know that's what she was doing. She was saying, "Daddy, look."
Just giving you a little heads up.
Okay, sorry. I'll get over that now.
Okay,
But if
perfect.
it comes back, I may bring it up again.
Okay.
So it's great to be here. And Father Jeremiah, I am so delighted that you're here. As we get started, I mean, one thing that I thought I'd start off by asking you, because I have a hunch that some people who are watching might love to know the answer to this, is how is your community dealing with what's going on right now? How is it experienced in a place like the one where you live?
Yeah, you know, so I live about 2 hours north of New York City, and there's 4 of us where I live, 4 friars in my friary, and every one of us is fine. But in terms of the whole community, I mean, we have a few friaries in the Bronx, Harlem, and we've probably had about 10 to 12 friars who have been sick, and about 4 of our sisters. But thank God everyone has recovered. Nobody's had to go to the hospital. But you know, our friars, we work a lot with the poor and the homeless, and we're in New York City, so we're very exposed and very vulnerable. But thank God everyone's pulling through, and all of us here are okay. So
good. I know some religious communities are getting hit hard. I mean, I think it was just yesterday there was news about the Maryknoll community in Ossining, which is not too far from you.
No, it's not.
And there's been several deaths and illnesses and things there. So, and of course, once it gets in,
Yeah.
then you have problems, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, may it continue. So one of the things that I really wanted to do in this hour or so that we have is for people to get to know you. Um, I will say, as the editor who sort of found your book and worked with you editing the book and then supervised publishing it, in many ways, I'll tell folks that what attracted me to it and to you is not just that you're a Franciscan and not just that you're a good writer, but that you are a priest who is good at talking about himself and his own struggles. In my experience, that's not a gift that every priest has.
Sure.
And so the stories that you tell in amid passing things are not just the sort of sermon that tells people what the meaning of a passage is and how they should live their lives, but you talk about your own experiences and how you have learned from your own mistakes. And I'd love for people to get to know you. So that's just kind of by way of introduction. But I pulled out a few quotes from your book that I loved as I went back through it the other day, preparing for this. And I found that you talking about things like desire and longing over and over, and again, coming out of your own life, is what appealed to me the most. And I have a hunch it will appeal to others as well. So I'm going to give you a quote from your book early on.
Uh-oh.
And it's just a sentence, but you said, looking back, the way I understand my vocation to religious life is the desire for something more. And you come back to that theme over and over, desire and desire for something more. So can you talk about that? Talk about desire. What does it mean? What has it meant in your life? How have you discerned it? And
Sure.
so on.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think ever since I was young, I had this desire to live life to its fullest, right? And our society and our culture tells us many ways in which we fulfill that. Whether it's through sports or whether it's through school or whether it's through relationships, getting married. All things that are good. And when I was young and growing up, especially teenage years, I was trying all of these things, right? I tried sports. I did well in school. I did all of these things, but nothing fully would ever satisfy me. There was still like this longing for more. And probably, I think when I was around, 18 or 19, I had this realization. I think I wrote about it in the book when I was traveling, that this more that I was always longing for was God, right? St. Augustine has the famous quote, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. And it really wasn't until I consciously came to this relationship with God where my restless heart began to experience a little bit of peace and a little bit of fulfillment, that this is actually what I'm made for. I'm made for God. And so, I think every one of us has this desire for God. It's put in by God and in our hearts. And I think one of the struggles in our age is that we are so busy and there's so many things clamoring for our attention. And yet the ironic thing is none of those things perfectly fulfill us. It's really only relationship with God. Now, that doesn't mean you have to become a monk, you have to become a Franciscan, of course not. But what it does mean is that our ultimate fulfillment ultimately comes from Him and from being in relationship with Him. So.
Now, I've been thinking that for the last 20 years, this is the third worldwide crisis moment that we've been in, this pandemic that we're in right now.
Yeah.
2020, will be the COVID pandemic. Hopefully, God willing, it'll only be 2020.
Yeah.
The Great Recession of 2008, 2009. A lot of us remember that too.
Yeah.
And then before that, 9/11. Sort of bookending the 2-decade period I'm talking about.
Yeah.
That earlier crisis time played a part in your vocation, didn't it? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, when 9/11 happened, I was a senior in college, and I was going to a college in Pennsylvania called Kutztown University. And it was at that time when I started discerning, specifically with my community. And I called, well, I first discovered my community 2 weeks after 9/11. And I found out the headquarters was in New York City. And this is 2 weeks after 9/11. I'm like, forget that. I'm not going to New York City. Like, forget that. But then every day, in prayer, it just kept coming back. Call the friars in New York, call the friars in New York. And so I called and I visited them probably in late October 2011, or 2001, excuse me. So probably about 6 or 7 weeks after 9/11. So yeah, I remember watching it when I was a senior in college and then discovering the community I felt joined was literally right there in New York City. And so it was kind of ironic, but the Lord led me there and I haven't left yet. So it's been good. Yeah.
One of the things that we promised people who were going to tune in to us today
Yeah.
was to talk about what do Franciscans do
Yeah.
and why. And I know you and I share an interest in the practical,
Yeah.
much less than the, speculative.
Yeah.
And so tell us, relating to desire and your vocation and figuring out who you are supposed to be in the world, how does that relate to what you do and maybe what you don't do and why?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's funny you asked that because, like I said, I've been a Franciscan for 18 years. And every time someone will see my sister, I have a sister who's 2 years older than me, they'll ask her about me. And she'll always say, I have no idea what he does. And she's been saying that for 18 years. It really hasn't changed much. But I think what St. Francis ultimately desired is he wanted to live the gospel, really. That's it. And you might ask, well, what's so unique about that? Well, when Francis was sort of starting, the way you lived the gospel was you either became a Benedictine monk or a diocesan priest. And Francis was like, no, I don't feel called, I don't feel like God's calling me to do that. I want to live the way the apostles lived, meaning he wanted to spend time in prayer like a monk, but he also wanted to be out serving, especially the poor in Assisi. And so I always like to say Franciscan life is sort of like this blend between monastic life and the act of what is known as religious life. So my community specifically, we have two main works. We work with the poor, the homeless, and we do a lot of evangelization. Those are kind of like the foundation of our life. And then intertwined in that is about 4.5 hours a day of prayer. So we have prayer every day. We have those ministries of working with the poor, or preaching. And then also another important aspect is just our fraternal life together. Like, we live as brothers, right? So it's not, we have priests and we have friars who are not priests or brothers, and, we're all equal here. And so the fraternal life is a pretty major aspect. Francis always said, the Lord gave me brothers. He didn't ask for them, right? But the Lord gave them to him. And so he saw his brothers as a gift from God. And so our fraternal life, our prayer life, and our ministry are the sort of the three pillars of our life. And believe it or not, it keeps us pretty busy, right? But I'm living in a sort of a special situation where I live in our community's house of prayer. So we're more withdrawn from the city, not as involved in an active apostolate. And I have more time to spend in things like hermitage, and I live in our retreat center, and so we have a couple hermitages on our property where I get to spend quite a lot of time in silence and solitude, and actually where I wrote half of the book. So in some ways it has become a ministry, the writing. So that's kind of really the core of the Franciscan life.
What does your day look like, schedule-wise? What do you do? When do you wake up?
So our first official time of prayer is at 6 o'clock in the morning. We meet at 6 o'clock in the morning. We pray office of readings together from the divine office. That takes about 15 minutes. And then we have about an hour and 20 minutes after that of private prayer. So you can go to your room, stay in the chapel. And then after that, at about 7:45, we gather and we pray morning prayer together. And then we have mass. And then I would say probably from about 9 o'clock until noon, at the house of prayer where I live in, it's mostly silent. So during that time, there might be some reading or some writing or some prayer, things like that, or spiritual direction. I do a lot of spiritual direction. And then at noon, again, we gather for midday prayer. And then the afternoon would be devoted to the apostolate, again, of some sort. And then 5 o'clock every evening, we have a Eucharistic Holy Hour together. And we pray evening prayer, and then we have dinner together. And we all take turns cooking, so we each get a night of cooking, and some nights are better than others, depending on who's cooking. Then our dinner together is kind of like a big, almost like family time. So we spend a good hour and 15 minutes just eating, talking, sharing about the day and things like that. And then after dinner, we gather for night prayer. We pray the rosary, and then we go back into silence. We're finished then around 8 p.m. So yeah, it's kind of the framework there. Yeah.
Are you doing any spiritual direction via Zoom these days?
It's mostly because of the pandemic. It's all over the phone. Yeah.
What's over the phone?
Yeah. Yeah. This is actually my first like Zoom experience. So it could be, maybe the Lord is trying to tell me something. Go Zoom. I don't know.
Well, you probably deal a lot with the question of desire when you are doing spiritual direction with folks, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I would think it'd be central. I'm going to give you another quote that I pulled out.
Okay.
So you return to the theme of desire over and over and over in Amid Passing Things. And you have one chapter that is devoted to desire as well, specifically. And this is a quote from that chapter. You have just talked about some of those things that you desired in your life that were sort of stages in your life. And you say this: when any one of these desires began to take shape inside my heart, it was as if a voice from some mysterious place whispered, "I am what you need. If you possess me, you will be complete." So what is that completeness that people seem to be seeking? And what is it that, you're able to tell people that you have found?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's funny. I think it's human nature. We look for our identity oftentimes in the things we do, right? So for example, when I was young playing baseball, there was a period of about 2 years where my identity was a baseball player, right? Who I was. If I was good at baseball, I was a pitcher. If I had a good game, that was who I was, right? And I think, we spend a lot of our lives like that, whether it's in our jobs, or our social status, or the things outside, extracurricular activities. And it wasn't really, again, like there's always an incompleteness that we experience that, because clearly we have to be more than what is external. And again, it wasn't really until I met the Lord and gave himself to me where I realized who I was had nothing with what I did. When I met the Lord and began to just give my heart, my life to him, I recognized and I realized, just like St. Francis, that I was a child of God. I was a son of God. And nothing could take that away. And nothing was better than that. Despite all the achievements and success of this world, it's not bad, of course. It's just never enough, unfortunately. And I think, the history of humanity shows that, that all the things of this world are good. The problem with them is they're just not enough. Yeah.
What do you find to be most difficult about the teachings of St. Francis? Is there a teaching or one or two of the sorts of things that he was often telling the friars, that we have in the texts from the early days, that you find difficult?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I don't think I've ever been asked that question before. I would say probably one of the most challenging things about Francis is that he is always 100% sincere in his living out of the gospel. You know, towards the end of his life, Francis experienced a bit of trouble in his own community with the brothers. You know, they thought his rule was too tough, and so there was a little bit of talking and gossiping and misunderstanding. And Francis was all about the gospel. He was all about living the gospel. And in this context, it meant forgiveness, right? It meant compassion. It meant him realizing this is not about me. You know, this is the Lord gave me this way of life, this Franciscan way of life. He gave me these brothers. And there was a part of him that had to step aside. And yeah, he was holy and all those things, but he was also human. And that's not an easy thing to do as a human being. It isn't easy for me, right? It's this call of John the Baptist to decrease so that Jesus can increase. And I think that to me, that's one of the things that stands out as a real challenge from Francis. Like he allowed himself to become little, you know, so that Jesus could increase in him. You know,
What aspect of your life as a friar now, do you find the most challenging, to live faithfully? What would be something that is really challenging for you even now, 18 years into religious life?
yeah, I think for me, the challenge is a balance between sort of an active life and a contemplative life. One of the things that first drew me to Franciscan life was that it was a balance between an active and contemplative life, because before I joined the friars, I was pretty seriously considering monastic life. I was discerning with the Trappists and those kind of communities, but I still felt the Lord calling me to be with the poor, to work with the poor. And so to me, that's always been the challenge for our life, because in my community does just many beautiful things, but especially the friars down in the city, they're very busy, very, very busy. And it's funny, when you're busy, the one thing that always can go is prayer, because we always think, I don't have enough time to pray, right? And for me, prayer it's my lifeline. It's like oxygen. I'm completely helpless without it. And so for me, I think that's always been the challenge. Franciscan life is always this tension between the active and the contemplative life. But I think I experience it maybe more so than some of the others. So
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you reminded me of something that I was wanting to bring up, which is uh, I love your religious order, your particular, I don't just mean the Franciscans, but your particular branch
yeah.
of Franciscanism, because it seems to me, as an outsider looking at you all, that you do such a great job combining
Hmm.
those two aspects of the life. Um, it's too easy, I think, sometimes in Catholicism, at least, in the religious orders among Catholics, to either be, peace and justice focused, or to be prayer and contemplative focused. And it isn't often that a person is able to figure out how to bring them together. It seems to me that your order in particular brings them together beautifully. So actually, why don't you say something about that, and you'll make your vocations director really happy.
Well, thank you, but it's always it's a challenge, right? It's always a tension. I think we've just realized that in order to do God's work, you have to be praying, right? Francis would go off into the caves of Assisi, and he would go off to pray for days, sometimes weeks, and spend time in hermitage alone, because he knew he needed to be with the Lord. He needed to be hearing from God, so that it wasn't just him, And I think my community, when we were starting, like, we realized this as well. Mother Teresa was a big influence for our founders. And when our founders, there was 8 of them who were Capuchin Franciscans, they actually met with Mother Teresa very early on, and she was encouraging them to have at least one holy hour every day, so a whole hour of Eucharistic adoration. And some of our friars were like, Mother, that's a great idea, but you know what it's like working with the poor. They don't have any boundaries. They're always ringing your doorbell. And Mother Teresa said to one of our founders, she said, if you don't give God an hour a day of Eucharistic adoration or of prayer in general, she said, it will be you and not Jesus who they meet. And the world doesn't need you. It needs Jesus in you. So she sealed the deal for
Yeah.
us. Yeah. So,
Well, and who can argue with her anyway, you know?
not me. She's holy. But it's a constant tension between a balance between prayer and a busy apostolic life. So it's a good tension. So.
Now, Sister Estelle just sent me a note that she has a question from an attendee. Sister Estelle, do you want to jump in?
Thanks so much. This is actually for both of you, and it's from Father Alan White, who's the chaplain, founder, and director at the St. Francis of Assisi Research Library at the Hope Center in Houston.
Ah.
And he said, the adage, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words. I should say the adage, preach the gospel at all times, when necessary, use words, has been attributed to St. Francis. How is that best modeled in our modern society today? And what is a unique Franciscan distinctive that is easily recognized but not seen in other religious orders?
Great question.
I'm letting you answer that, Father Jeremiah.
I was going to say the same. I think probably one of the distinctive elements of Franciscanism is joy. Francis was a joyful person. He would oftentimes be singing. You know, there's a great story of St. Francis when he's walking through the woods and he's singing and he's praising the Lord, and these two robbers come out and rob him and beat him and pretty much knock him on the head and leave him for dead. And as soon as they leave, Francis just gets back up and starts singing. And so I think one of the, not that other religious are not joyful, but I think one of the distinctive characteristics of Franciscans is joy, for sure.
And isn't that the same story where Francis says to the robbers, I don't have anything you can take anyway?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Like, you picked the wrong guy to rob. You know?
Well, no, there's a deeper meaning to that too.
Yeah.
I mean, what I have, you can't take.
Right, exactly, yeah.
You can have what's in my pockets, I suppose, but there probably wasn't anything there anyway.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. I at first, when you were talking about joy, I thought you were going to tell my favorite story about Francis, the one where he and Brother Leo are walking in the rain. Of course, you know that one.
Yeah.
You know, and Francis keeps saying, you know, do you know what the sort of the meaning of life is, Leo? And they're walking in the rain, and Leo is so annoyed that he keeps asking him questions because he just wants to get out of the rain. And, you know, finally they get to they're getting close to where they're headed, and Francis says, you know, if we get to where we're going, and if we knock on the door, and if they slam the door in our face and say, go away, and then if we keep waiting and it keeps raining and we get wetter and wetter, and, you know, if we're really cold to the bone, and then if, you know, finally, you know, we might be able to get, you know, to a warm spot. Well, before we get to the warm spot, you know, that was the joy, you know, it was the moment. It wasn't the suffering. It's not like he loved to suffer. He loved the moment.
Right. Yeah.
Now, do you get a chance to get outdoors? I see you are not outdoors right now. Where are you?
So I'm at our retreat center. So like I said, our friary is about a half a block away from where I am right now. But yeah, we're in the middle of 60 acres. So we're in the Catskill Mountains range. So I'm in the woods right now, but I'm in our retreat center.
Do you get to go on long walks and things like that?
I do.
What kind of wildlife do you see in the Catskills these days? We
have a black bear on our property.
Really?
Yeah, we haven't seen him for a while, but he's around. We actually have coyotes as well, so you're not the only one.
Yeah, but this is Milwaukee.
Yeah, so we have coyotes. We have a lot of deer. Yeah, and that's in terms of that's pretty much about it.
Do you ever see baby black bears?
We have not yet. Yeah.
I lived in Vermont for 20 years, and there was one summer when there were some baby black bears that were on the mountain up behind my house.
Oh, nice.
And I would walk my dog up the mountain every day, and every now and then he would see them and they would go running up a tree, and it was fun to watch them sort of grow up that summer. But then I didn't see them anymore.
Yeah. We used to have a bird feeder in our front yard, but then the bear kept coming and eating all the bird food. So we got rid of the bird food.
Yeah. Well, so turning from joy, I want to pivot, hopefully not too dramatically, but I want to talk at least for a minute about death,
Okay.
because I love Francis of Assisi's teaching on death, and you write about it, you talk about it in Amid Passing Things. Can you say something about Francis on death, and how does it either relate in your own life, and how maybe does it relate into how you minister to other people?
Yeah. I mean, Francis referred to death as sister death, and I think why it sounds strange. Why would he call it sister death? And you'll oftentimes see pictures of Francis holding a skull and looking at it. And some of our friars actually have a little skull on their rosary that's connected to their cincture. And people will always ask, like, isn't that kind of morbid? Like, why do you have a skull on your rosary? And it's not in a fascination with death, but it's a reminder that, each one of us is going to die. And Francis would see death as this bridge between us and eternal life, and as not something to be afraid of, but something to be accepted in the life of each one of us, because it's through death only that we come to meet the Lord. And obviously that sounds great, and we can kind of have nice meditations on that, but when it actually happens in our life, it hurts. And in the book, I think I talk about two people specifically: my grandmother who died, and then my mom who died. And so my grandmother died when I was 18 years old. I was a senior in high school, and her death was really the beginning of an awakening for me, because I can remember being at my grandmother's funeral and seeing her in the casket and thinking, I'm never going to see my grandmother again. Like, I couldn't comprehend such a reality, because, I saw her every day. And, when you're 18, you think everything's just going to continue. And so it was really at that point where I started questioning things more deeply, like, what is life about? And it really, again, it brought me, so the death of my grandmother brought me to God. It helped open my heart. And even then, with the death of my mother, my mother had Alzheimer's for many, many years, and her death was a profound experience of God for me. I was actually anointing my mother. So I was a priest for 1 year at this time when my mom died. And so my dad and my sister and I were there with my mother. She was in hospice. And I was anointing my mother, giving her last rites. And, tears are pouring out of my eyes. We're all crying, obviously, because we know my mom's dying. But I have to admit, in that room, the presence of God was so thick and so tangible. So in my humanity, there was these tears and this heartache and this sorrow. But on another level, there was this gentle, loving, consoling presence of God. And it was this reminder that death is a bridge to eternal life, and that it's not an end. That what we might see with our eyes or even feel in our heart, that this is over, that I'll never see this person again, is not true, right? That it is a bridge that leads us ultimately to what we long for, this face-to-face, meeting with the Lord. And so that's why we have a skull in our rosary. We're not obsessed with death or anything like that, but it is a great reminder, right, of what death is. It is actually the beginning of life. I think in the funeral liturgy, there's a beautiful line. It says, "For your faithful people, life has not ended, but it's been transformed, through death." So
I want to take you back a step too, though, because before the consoling presence of God and before the hope of heaven, what about the way in which Francis embraced the tangibleness of death? You and I have talked about this. We like physical things, tangible things, which is partly why, Zoom conversations are difficult. But at the end of his life, Francis asks the friars who are caring for him as he knows he's dying to lay his body on the ground. He wants to feel the dirt, the soil under his body. I mean, how does that relate to Francis in embracing sister death?
Yeah, you know, Francis saw all creation, right, as his brothers and sisters. And I think why? Because all of creation to Francis was a fingerprint or a footprint or, of God, right, of the Creator. And sometimes Franciscans are always painted as loving nature, loving the environment, and all those things. And it's true because they're reflections of the Creator, right? And so Francis lived very close to the earth, not only with the poor, but in his own humanity. It was this reminder to his humanity of the Creator. You know, there's so many stories when Francis would see a sunset, he would just start weeping, you know? Why was it? Yeah, because the sunset's beautiful, but he also saw what was beyond the sunset, right? The Creator who was in some ways painting this masterpiece. And it just moved Francis so deeply.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I want to ask you at least one more thing, and then we'll let some folks who are watching ask some questions because I know questions have been coming in.
Okay.
But it's not exactly about death to talk about letting go. And that's another theme that I remember from your book, Loving, letting go. You talk about that over and over. And it's one of those things that we are terrible at. I mean, the human being as a species, I'm sure, is just terrible at letting go. But I'm going to give you my last short little quote from your book. And it's this: if someone were to ask, what is the secret of life? I would answer, letting go.
Did I say that?
You said that.
And I stand by that truth. It's and I think it's something that I've noticed as I'm beginning to get a little bit older. And the reason why I say that is because I began my life with my own ideas, with my own agenda, with my own plans. And I even brought that with me in my conversion, in my religious life. My life as a Franciscan, so I thought, is going to look like this. It has to look like this. I have to be like this. I have to say this or do this or think this way. And the problem with that is there's a lot of us involved. There's a lot of me involved. And I think the more and more time I would be spending in prayer, I realized the Lord had a very different image. He had a very different plan, a very different agenda for what my life was supposed to look like. You know, I think this is something certainly the apostles experience over and over and over again, right? There's a lot of pride and there's a lot of vanity in the apostles. They come to Jesus, Jesus, we want to sit at your right and your left, you know, or Peter, Jesus, don't say these things, right? They have to learn that his way, God's ways, are very different than ours, right? And so I think this letting go of the way we think things should be, even our relationship with God, and allowing God to really show us, no, this is actually the way I want it to be, is difficult. As you said, I'm certainly not very good at it, but it seems to me to be the real essence of discipleship. You know, Jesus says if you're going to seek your own life, you're going to lose it. But if you lose your life, if you let go, you will find it when you allow me to direct and guide your life.
Which directly relates to the title of your book, right?
Mm.
Amid passing things, which comes from that prayer after communion.
Yes.
As we walk amid passing things, you teach us by them to love the things of heaven and hold fast to what endures.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's make sure we save some time here because I think we wanted to try and keep ourselves to an hour. And I know we have a bunch of questions from people who are watching. So maybe Sister Estelle can chime in.
Thanks so much. And since you're on the subject of the book, we actually did have a question about that from an anonymous attendee. This is for Father Jeremiah. Can you talk about your writing process for the book, and will you write another book? Thank
you. It's a good question. Let me ask the the last question first. So will I write another book? I don't know. I think I didn't really necessarily plan to write this one. It kind of wrote itself. And so it is something I've been praying about and waiting on the Lord. If the Lord wants me to write another book, he's gonna have to inspire me. It's funny because since this book came out, right now I have 3 other books that I've started writing. And they're all going nowhere because there's too much of me involved. I'm trying too hard. And so I had to put it down, and I basically had to say, Lord, okay, if you want me to write another book, here I am. But if not, then that's fine too. So I don't know. We'll see whatever God wants, hopefully. So sorry, I forgot what the first question was.
Your process. What was your process in writing? I remember you needed your hermitage time. Yes.
So it probably took me about a year and a half to write the book total. And that was like part-time because, as a priest, I'm not a full-time writer. So I have other things going on. And I have to be honest, literally this book just wrote itself. Like one day I just wrote this reflection. It was the first one. And then in my free time, I was getting ideas, or even in times of prayer, different ideas would come to my mind. And then when I had a chance to sit down and write, I would just write, and then they just sort of wrote themselves. And then I had extended periods of time in hermitage where I didn't have really any of the ministry. So I had time to devote to writing. And probably in terms of practical, I probably had an hour or 2 a day where I could just devote to writing, which for a real writer is not much, but for a priest, it is a lot. So that was the process. Yeah, I'd be honest with you, I don't really know what I'm doing. It just kind of works. So.
Well, it's fabulous. I mean, one of the things I sometimes joke around on social media, and it was just this morning that I posted that fabulous, there's a few of them, but one of those fabulous illustrations of Saint Hildegard of Bingen, where it's like the hand of God is on her head like this while she has a pen in her hand. And my comment was something like, may this happen to you this morning while you're writing.
That's right.
It doesn't happen all the time that way.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Yeah.
All right, Sister Estelle, what else do you have?
Okay, Michael Carney says about desire. Desire, of course, can lead us in destructive directions. And there are some who say that because of this, desire must be quenched or crushed. Someone has said, though, that the only way to deal with bad desire is to replace it with good desire, and plenty of it. Could you comment on this and describe good ways to struggle to do this?
I love that question. And in your answer, I'm going to feel like I'm one of your spiritual directors.
That's right. I think, like anything, there's obviously there's good desires and there's bad desires, right? And even St. Ignatius talks about in his rules of discernment, what he refers to, the way the good spirit, God, calls us, and the way the bad spirit, the enemy, calls us. So any desires that are going to pull us away from God or cause tension or fright or even anxiety in our relationships with other people, particularly in our relationships with God, those are obviously desires we don't want to follow, right? But I think in the bottom of each one of our hearts, there's a desire for love, for truth, for beauty. And I think the question is, as we pursue these things, and sometimes we're going to make bad decisions, but as we pursue these things to fulfill those desires, are they really working? Like, are they really fulfilling me? If I'm really fulfilled, I tend to be less anxious, less angry. Not that these things are going to dismiss those things automatically, but if I'm going in the direction of God, right? St. Paul talks about the fruits of the Spirit. If I'm moving with these good desires towards God, then there will be, on some level in my life, a certain amount of joy, a certain amount of peace, a certain amount of patience. Not that we don't have bad days or fly off the handle or anything like that, but when we're allowing our good desires to lead us to God, we'll notice the fruit in our lives, I think. So I hope that's helpful. It's a great question.
It's great. Thank you. Okay, here's another one by Elizabeth Tumbas. How do we live a life of prayer and letting go when we are living in the world with a family, spouse, children, grandchildren? Can be a huge struggle.
Yes, it can.
John, that sounds like it's yours.
No. I'm smiling because I've struggled with that one my whole life. I like you and I share some things in common, Father Jeremiah, of course, and I think we've talked about some of that. But one of them is when I was 18, I was also discerning religious life, and I was very drawn to the Trappists.
Hmm.
And I still make an annual retreat at a Trappist monastery and keep up connections there.
Yeah.
And I love that, and it's sort of deep inside of me. But instead, I've been married my whole adult life, and I have 4 kids and a mortgage, and
Yeah.
and, as someone who tries to live, a so-called secular life according to Franciscan principles, it's difficult for me to do things like have a mortgage and reconcile that. And sometimes it's just difficult for me to be happy in my domestic life and be reconciled to wanting to be more and more like Christ and like Francis. So anyway, that's
Yeah.
my contribution. Now you answer the question.
Yeah, I think it was Elizabeth who asked that question. But Elizabeth, that's a great question. And I think what's important here is it seems like what God desires most is not so much quantity, but quality, right? So if you're married and you have children and mortgage and all the things, clearly God's not asking you to live like a Carthusian monk or even a Franciscan, meaning having hours a day of prayer, right? So we meet God in our real life situations. So if you have 10 minutes a day where you can devote to prayer, that's fantastic. I mean, that's great. God knows what your life is like. I think in terms of prayer, he's just asking us, can you just give me a little bit of time each day where you turn from everything and just face me, receive my love? For some people, they might have an hour to do that. For other people, they might have 10 minutes. It's funny. I have a friend who's, they have 6 children, and the wife, the wife will oftentimes go into the bathroom to pray. And I said,
Yeah,
why do you do that? She's like, it's the only place where no one will disturb me.
absolutely. Of course.
So she goes in there, she said, for like 15 minutes every morning, and no one thinks twice because moms, whatever women do in there, I don't know, but it's just assumed that that's where they go. And so that's where she goes to pray. So I think, again, what God seems more concerned about is quality, not so much length of time or saying a certain amount of prayers, but just to try to turn to God, even if it's only 5 or 10 minutes a day, that it will change your life. It'll change your life.
I want to jump in with a question now, though. So the severity of Francis is so appealing to me, to many people. The severity, the commitment side that demands everything of you can be so appealing to religiously oriented people like me and you. So, or like earlier when you mentioned how when some people cook in your friary, it's better than when others cook. I actually was thinking to myself, of course, Francis said, you couldn't even soak the beans to cook tomorrow because you had to only cook what you had right in front of you right now. You had to beg for your bread.
Yeah.
You couldn't, he would rebuke the brother for soaking the beans for tomorrow's dinner.
Yeah.
And that's so appealing, right? And so that's why it's difficult to have a mortgage, because
Sure.
if I really want to be like Francis, I wouldn't have a mortgage, So what do you, surely you get that from some of your spiritual directees. They want that severity. There's something so appealing about that.
Yeah, for sure. I think what's more appealing, like to me, so Francis obviously was a very severe person, but let's not forget too, what Saint Francis did when he was dying. He apologized to his body, which he would ironically always call brother ass.
Yep.
Right? And he said, basically, he said, forgive me, brother ass, because I've been too hard on you. Right? And that's pretty profound to think. Like he realized he was too hard on his body and probably too hard on himself. But what made Francis a saint was not his asceticism or his discipline, but his heart that was just open and in love with God, right? And to me, the greatest form of asceticism and discipline is accepting the life God has given us, right? When we fully accept and embrace the life God has given to us, whether it's marriage with kids, religious life, or whatever, it's right there in that context where we are given all the means, all the grace necessary to be holy, to be a saint, right? You know, sometimes people say, like, oh, if I was a Franciscan like you, I'd be holy. Well, I'm not holy and I'm a Franciscan. So it doesn't come with the vocation, right? It comes with the response of our hearts to God in the particular vocation he's given us. I oftentimes say to married couples, especially those who have kids, I could never live the way you do. Like you, in my opinion, are holy. You know, I could never, you know, I would be a terrible husband. I'd always be leaving to go off on hermitage and things like that. And so God knew what he was doing in calling me to be a Franciscan, you know. So I think it's in the context of the life that God has given to us and accepting it. That's the real asceticism.
It's like Carlo Corretto, you know, the great writer Carlo Corretto, who spent 30 years in the desert being a contemplative, and then he went back and visited his mother and realized that his mother was much more of a contemplative than he ever would be.
For sure, for sure, yeah.
All right, Sister Estelle, do you have a couple more?
I do. Thanks a lot. I have a question from Jackie. This is for Father Jeremiah. Father Jeremiah, have you ever felt lost or maybe was tempted to lose hope? And if so, how'd you come out of it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jackie. Have I ever felt lost? Most of my life, yes. However, I've never lost hope, thanks be to God. When I say that I feel lost, you know, I mean, just like everyone else, you know, I don't walk around feeling like I know what I'm doing, or I know what God is saying, or I know where God is leading. You know, St. Paul says we walk by faith and not by sight. And so I just try to live my life trusting that God is present, trusting that God is leading. But when it comes down to it, in terms of practical details, I have no idea what I'm doing. So, but I've never lost hope because, you know, I think if there's one thing that we have as Christians, it is hope. You know, this is the Easter season. And what do we say? In the Eastern Church, they always say this refrain, you know, Christ is risen. You know, Christ is risen. He is our hope and he is our life. And in many ways, that's all we need in this life is to trust that, to trust the reality of his resurrection. And if we're trusting that, if our eyes are on him, he's going to lead us to where we need to be, where he wants us. So that's how I try to live my life. Certainly struggle with that as well. So
good. Thank you, Father Jeremiah. We also have a question from another attendee. Father Jeremiah, could you talk a little more about joy and peace? How do you find it amidst suffering? A lot of people nowadays are going through anxiety, suffering, uncertainty about the future. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a very common experience right now. You know, everyone I'm talking to on the phone is anxious, is worried, and is afraid. But here's, you know, one of the things that's been interesting. So the past month or 6 weeks, however long we've been in lockdown, all of my spiritual direction has been on the phone. And for most of those people, about half of my directees are religious, so religious sisters or nuns, and the other half are lay people. And this has been a very difficult Easter because obviously there's no public masses, you know, or so people are living without the sacraments. And there's natural anxiety that people are experiencing. One of the questions I always ask them, I'm like, is the Lord still present in your life? And they'll tell me about moments, even in the midst of this, where they sense God's presence, or in times of prayer where they feel like the Lord is near. I'm like, this is the reality we need to choose to live from, right? I think St. Paul says in Colossians, he says, seek the things that are above, right? And so I think what he means by that, or at least the way I understand that, is like, yes, here in this world, amid passing things, there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of fear right now. And all of that is real. There's no denying the suffering that's going on. But that's not the end of the story. It's not the full picture, right? Like I said in the previous question, Christ and his resurrection is the full horizon. The suffering that we're encountering now or in this life is 1/8 of that horizon. You know, I think scientists tell us we use 10% of our brains, I think, right? Well, we can translate that into spiritual terms. Like, we can't see the fullness of reality, but we know that Christ is the fullness of reality. We know that his death conquers suffering, that his death ultimately conquers death. So yes, the suffering is real right now, no doubt. But I think in this time, we're called to look through the suffering. What's on the other side? What's over the suffering? It's the presence of God. That doesn't change, that coronavirus or anything cannot take away. So I hope that's helpful, Jackie.
That's great. Thank you, Father Jeremiah. Here's another interesting question from Steve Bowman. I'm a novice in the Order of Ecumenical Franciscans and wanted to know if you see an increasing interest in the Franciscan incarnational worldview from evangelicals and Protestants trying to reconcile incongruities of a moralistic, angry God with an everything belongs experiential theology of Francis.
To be honest with you, I don't have much contact with specifically evangelicals and who are interested in the Franciscans. So I don't have, short answer, I don't have much contact with them. So
I will chime in though and say, was it Steve?
Yes, it was Steve.
Absolutely. I see this. I've been seeing it for 20 or 30 years. And
Yeah.
it's part of my own personal journey. I grew up an evangelical Christian, joined the Catholic Church as an adult. And it was really, I've always felt it was St. Francis who brought me to the Catholic Church. Not that you can't, be Christian and if you're not Catholic, but that was my journey, my path. And it was definitely an opening, a broadening of perspective about the kinds of issues that Steve was asking in his question. And I see it again and again on all of the kind of topics that we've talked about. Francis's teachings on death, his teachings on joy, his teachings, and the way he lived his life. I mean, going back to the topic of what we promised to be talking about. What do Franciscans do and why? Francis did a lot of things that might not have made sense according to sort of different Christian worldviews, but make perfect sense coming out of the kind of life he was living of faithfulness to the gospel. So anyway, yes, just in affirming Steve, yes, I see that a lot.
That's great. Thank you. Chris Leone, who's an OFS, said, what's the name of the retreat center in Monticello that you're at, Father Jeremiah?
Well, believe it or not, it's called St. Francis Retreat.
That was easy.
You guys are so creative.
I know, we're not very original around here.
That's great. He also said, what does it mean to go from gospel to life and life to gospel, and how do we live it actively?
To me, it seems we're talking here about the integration, right, of our relationship with God. And I think when we begin, our spiritual life is kind of we have it in a category the way we would have like maybe exercise or work. It's something we do maybe a certain amount of time each day or a week. And I think the more and more as we draw deeper in our relationship with God, God begins to just take over our entire life where there's not so much a separation. So yes, there's times when I'm praying for sure, but also when I'm shopping or working, I'm still aware of God's presence and I'm still living in God's presence. And so to me, it seems like, I mean, that's ultimately, at least the way I understand it, the goal of really of a spiritual life is to have an integrated life where God is not distant or where he's not just something I do on Sunday morning or 20 minutes each day or whatever. So.
That's great. Wow, we have so many good questions. I think we might have to continue this another week.
Well, I'm not going anywhere, so.
Okay.
We can
I'm
do
sorry
it.
we couldn't get to everybody's questions, but do you think that is enough for today? And we'll see where we can get up next week, maybe, or the week after.
Sounds good. I think we will all be confined to our homes for another week at
A
least.
little while. Yep, I think so too. Well, thank you both so much. And thank you for sharing about Franciscan spirituality and Father Jeremiah, your new book. And thank you to everyone who joined us. Father Jeremiah's book, Amid Passing Things, and several of John Sweeney's books on Franciscan spirituality are available from your local booksellers and, of course, from paracletepress.com. They're 20% off today if you order. Amid Passing Things is the perfect gift for Father's Day coming up, and most especially for anyone discerning and desiring God's voice in their life. Father Jeremiah's writing is both tender and refreshingly honest. He helps us capture the life that God intends for any of us who fully invest in a relationship with him. It's really one of the best books I've read this year. Free shipping is available this month on orders over $45. So please consider gifting these books to friends and family. Your generosity will not only help support Father Jeremiah and his order in their work and ministry, it will also help Paraclete Press in our ongoing work in providing free webinars such as this at this time. We really hope you enjoyed this talk as much as we did. We hope to continue it. So please tune in again. Our prayers are with all of you for health and safety, and we hope you will join us for more of these times together with our authors. Our calendar of Zoom events is available on our website, paracletepress.com. Thank you all so much, and God bless you all.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thank
See
you.
you soon.